One of the world's most expensive scientific experiments was not undone by a rival lab, nor a policy vote, but by the hand of a young African president with a memory sharper than a scalpel. In August 2023, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso ordered the immediate dismantling of the Target Malaria project, an initiative bankrolled with hundreds of millions by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Labs were shut down. Genetically modified mosquitoes were ordered to be destroyed. Fieldwork was frozen. The West called it a setback. Africa called it a stand. Because this was not just about mosquitoes. This was about history, about wounds that never closed, about the right to say no, even to billions. Stay with us, because this is not just about insects. It's about identity. Subscribe and join the story of a continent reclaiming its breath. What could turn a celebrated public health campaign into a symbol of betrayal? It began with a promise to defeat one of Africa's deadliest diseases using the sharpest tool modern science could offer: gene editing. The Target Malaria project, launched in 2005 and backed by more than $170 million, aimed to reduce malaria transmission by releasing genetically modified mosquitoes into select African environments. These insects, altered at the molecular level, were engineered to produce predominantly male offspring. The logic was simple. Only female mosquitoes bite and spread malaria. Fewer females meant fewer infections. On paper, it sounded revolutionary. The science came from Imperial College London, a prestigious Western institution leading the gene drive technology. It held the patents. It controlled the research. But the field trials? They were to be done in Africa, specifically Burkina Faso, the first African country to approve such a trial. Scientists reassured communities. The gene drive technology wouldn't spread uncontrollably. Local biosafety authorities gave their green light. The National Ethics Committee approved it. Community consent was claimed to be secured. Researchers hosted countless engagement meetings across villages, explaining how the male-biased mosquitoes would disappear over time, taking malaria with them. Then came the test. On the 11th August 2023, a batch of genetically modified male mosquitoes was quietly released into Burkina Faso's skies as part of a pilot phase. Official statements insisted this wasn't the full gene drive rollout. It was only a limited trial. But the infrastructure already in place told a larger story. High-security laboratories had been built, researchers had been trained for years, and foreign investment had poured into the project. 7 days later, President Ibrahim Traoré stunned the world. In a sudden and sweeping decision, his government suspended all operations of Target Malaria, citing national sovereignty and public concern. Every lab was ordered to halt activities. Every field sample was to be destroyed. The billion-dollar machine stopped in its tracks, not because of scientific failure, but because of something deeper: distrust. Traoré's move sparked outrage among proponents of the project, particularly in Western media. Commentators accused the Burkina Faso government of abandoning science. But on the ground, in the fields and homes of farmers, the sentiment was different. There was relief. There was applause. There was memory. Because this wasn't the first time foreign-funded biotechnology had landed on African soil with promises of salvation, only to leave behind broken systems and wounded economies. The mosquitoes, in essence, became a symbol, not just of experimental science, but of an experiment long repeated on African soil. Innovation without inclusion, trials without transparency, and advancement without African agency. This was no longer a health initiative. It had become a question of dignity. What happens when the lab coat becomes a cloak for control? Long before genetically modified mosquitoes took flight, Africa's soil had already been seeded with another kind of promise, one that sprouted into crisis. In the early 2000s, Burkina Faso was heralded as a success story of biotech agriculture. With generous backing from Monsanto and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the country introduced Bt cotton, a genetically modified strain engineered to resist pests and boost yields. Farmers were assured it would revive the economy. Cotton, after all, was more than a crop. It was the pride of Burkina Faso, contributing over 60% of the country's export earnings. But within a few years, that pride turned to loss. The modified cotton did resist pests for a while. Then nature pushed back. Bollworms, the very insects Bt cotton was designed to defeat, developed resistance. Meanwhile, the fiber quality of the GMO variety deteriorated drastically. International buyers rejected Burkina Faso's exports. Prices collapsed. By 2016, the government officially abandoned GMO cotton, citing economic damage and reputational harm. Farmers had lost millions. An entire sector had fallen, and the betrayal went deeper. Smallholder farmers, once self-reliant, found themselves trapped in a cycle. GMO seeds were patented, meaning farmers could not reuse them. Each season, they had to purchase new seeds at prices up to 5 times higher than traditional varieties. Alongside the seeds came companion chemicals, glyphosate, pesticides, herbicides, sold by the same corporations that produced the seeds. What began as a promise of independence quickly became a contract of dependence. In South Africa, where GMO maize and cotton dominate, more than 85% of maize and nearly all cotton is genetically engineered. Who controls these seeds? Not African companies, not local cooperatives, but multinationals. Monsanto, now Bayer, Syngenta, Corteva, holding the patents, setting the terms, reaping the profits. Each seed became a chain. Biodiversity paid the price too. Indigenous seed varieties, cultivated for generations, were displaced. Once lost, they could not be easily recovered. Africa's heritage, its agricultural resilience, was eroded gene by gene. And through it all, the narrative persisted that this was progress, that this was modernization, that Africans should be grateful. But memory says otherwise. When news broke of genetically modified mosquitoes, many Africans didn't just think of malaria, they remembered Bt cotton. They remembered the collapse. They remembered promises that tasted of control. This wasn't a resistance to science. It was a resistance to a familiar script. The kind of script where foreign foundations fund innovation, but foreign institutions own the patents. Where the testing happens in African villages, but the intellectual property lives in Western labs. Where Africa becomes the front line of risk and the last to benefit. So when President Traoré halted the mosquito program, he wasn't just shutting down a lab, he was reopening a wound, and he was refusing to let it fester again. If a seed can break a sector, what can a gene-modified insect do to a continent? In the glow of sterile labs and polished presentations, it is easy to miss the one question that defines true progress. Who holds the power? The Target Malaria project, like many initiatives before it, was painted as a partnership, but beneath the language of cooperation lay a glaring asymmetry. The core of the technology, the gene editing process itself, was not developed in Ouagadougou nor in any African capital. It was carried out in state-of-the-art laboratories at Imperial College London, an institution that does not merely collaborate, but owns. Imperial College holds the key patents behind Target Malaria. It controls the intellectual property, the legal rights to the modified mosquito's genetic architecture. Burkina Faso, by contrast, was responsible for rearing, monitoring, and releasing the insects, but not for steering the science. This division of roles is not coincidental. It is structural. It mirrors a pattern that runs deep through the veins of foreign-funded innovation in Africa. The brains stay abroad, the bodies are local. This is not scientific partnership. It is outsourced risk. African scientists and activists have called it out plainly. They are not anti-science. They are not anti-technology. What they oppose is being positioned as subjects rather than stakeholders. What they reject is the idea that Africa must host experiments whose full consequences are unknown without holding the reins. And they have good reason. The case of GMO cotton left more than just economic scars. It left legal ones. Patents restricted how farmers could use their seeds. Local scientists had no say in how data was stored or shared. Agricultural autonomy was fractured, one legal clause at a time. Now, with genetically modified mosquitoes, the stakes are higher. This is not agriculture. This is ecology. A gene-edited mosquito, once released, cannot be recalled. There is no undo function in nature. If something goes wrong, it goes wrong in real time, on African soil, with African communities bearing the burden. Here, we must name the dynamic clearly. This is not a gap in knowledge. It is a gap in ownership. The danger is not the technology itself, but the structure surrounding it. A structure where African consent is claimed, but African control is absent. Where the benefits are projected, but the costs are lived. Where sovereignty is praised in speeches, but dissolved in signatures. And this is where the term Anti-Colonial Africa returns, not as nostalgia, but as a mirror. Because if the patents are foreign, the funding is foreign, the labs are foreign, and only the test subjects are African, then what exactly has changed? We do not need to imagine conspiracy. We only need to trace the structure. This is modern colonialism, one activist declared. But instead of armies, it arrives with white coats and research grants. And so Traoré's intervention was not an act of paranoia. It was an assertion that sovereignty is not just about flags and borders. It's about who owns the genome of a mosquito released on your land. The scars of anti-colonial Africa live on each time we're handed an untested promise. What happens when the front lines of innovation are drawn on someone else's skin? When President Traoré halted the Target Malaria project, the corridors of African villages buzzed louder than the laboratories of London. But the world's response? Silence. There were no official statements from major Western governments, no emergency press briefings from the World Health Organization, no urgent headlines in the global science press. For a project backed by over $170 million, the quiet was deafening. Yet in West Africa, the reactions were loud and clear. Civil society coalition Copagen declared, "We will not be your guinea pigs." Their message echoed through community halls, universities, and rural farms, not out of ignorance but out of memory. Mariam Bessie, a Nigerian health rights activist, warned, "We do not want to be lab rats for exterminator technology." Her words were visceral, sharpened by decades of reproductive experiments and pharmaceutical scandals that never made it to Western courtrooms. Activists pointed out a recurring pattern. Groundbreaking technologies often arrive in Africa first, not because Africa is leading the charge, but because it bears the risk. They do not reach London, nor Los Angeles, nor Geneva. They arrive in Ouagadougou, Accra, Lagos, places where regulation is often underfunded, oversight thin, and consent contested. But the most revealing reaction was not what was said, but what was not. The United States, a major funder of agricultural research in Africa, remained mute. The European Union, home to Imperial College and its gene labs, issued no comment. Even as the entire project collapsed publicly, there was no diplomatic defense, no media pushback. And here lies the deeper revelation. If the world does not speak when an African nation asserts control, it is not because they agree. It is because they were never listening in the first place. Traoré's decision was not simply a health policy, it was a political act, a symbolic rejection of the idea that science, when funded from abroad, must always be accepted at home. This silence was louder than approval. African sovereignty was being rewritten, and nobody was watching. If sovereignty can be coded out in a lab, can it ever be coded back in? Science cannot undo a scar, but memory can prevent a wound. from reopening. As the dust settles over the dismantled laboratories of Burkina Faso, the world faces a crucial question, not about mosquitoes, but about momentum. What now? The suspension of Target Malaria leaves a vacuum. Malaria remains a deadly threat across sub-Saharan Africa. Children still die, hospitals still overflow, and foreign funders will return with new trials, new technologies, new grants. But something has shifted. For the first time in decades, an African government did not just negotiate the terms of the experiment, it terminated it outright. Not out of ignorance, but out of principle, out of memory, out of self-respect. This act has ignited a new conversation, not about whether Africa should engage in science, but about how, on whose terms, and to what end. A future grounded in dignity will require more than rejecting foreign projects. It will demand building alternatives, homegrown research, public health strategies shaped by local knowledge, agricultural models that protect biodiversity while feeding growing populations. It means investing in African universities, not just as satellite field sites, but as epicenters of innovation. It means writing laws that put patent rights in African hands, training scientists who answer to their communities, not to boards abroad, funding solutions that flow upward from the soil, not downward from spreadsheets. And above all, it means remembering. Because memory, in the African context, is not passive. It is active, protective, revolutionary. Just as the scars of cotton and seed are remembered, so too will be the moment a nation said, "This ends here." And that memory will be a compass, not just for Burkina Faso, but for a continent increasingly unwilling to be a laboratory for someone else's vision. If memory is power, then Africa is remembering loudly. If one country can say no to a billion-dollar project, who's next? This was never just about mosquitoes. It was about maps drawn not on paper, but on the body. It was about who gets to rewrite nature and who gets rewritten. When President Ibrahim Traoré shut down the Target Malaria project, he didn't just interrupt a scientific experiment. He drew a line in the sand. A line between progress and permission, between help and hegemony. The lesson from Burkina Faso is not that Africans fear science. It is that they fear history repeating itself in lab coats. From the engineered seed to the engineered insect, the script has felt too familiar. Outsiders bring the solution, locals carry the risk. And when things collapse, Africa is left holding the silence. But this time, the silence was broken. This is the voice of Anti-Colonial Africa, not nostalgic, but forward-facing. A continent refusing to accept that sovereignty ends at the microscope. A people who know that to lose control of biology is to lose control of destiny. The world may still ignore what happened in Burkina Faso. Headlines may still praise philanthropic ambition. But in village squares, universities, and presidential offices across the continent, a new refrain is rising. No more experiments without ownership. No more aid without dignity. This is the new frontier of African sovereignty, where decisions about health, food, and life are no longer outsourced, where memories become boundaries, where scars become shields. And Anti-Colonial Africa will not whisper its warnings anymore. It will declare them in policy, in science, in soil. If this resonates, don't scroll past. Subscribe. Share this story. Let the next generation inherit truth, not trials.